Happy Monday and happy fall and welcome to the New Testament. You guys are doing a great job making your way through the Bible. You're way more than halfway through. You'll just be reading through the New Testament for the rest of the year. This week and next week we'll be in the Gospel of Matthew. You started it on. Congratulations. A couple preliminary remarks before we get into today's reading, which is chapters 5 and 6, the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount. One comment, Jesus, as we have come from the Old Testament to the New Testament, there was 400 years between Malachi and Matthew. Often people call that the silent years because there was no prophet, there was no revelation during that period of time. It was broken by the coming of John the Baptist with his message, repent, for the kingdom of heaven or the kingdom of God is at hand. And then Jesus came right after John the Baptist with the same message. And Jesus has come into a dreadfully sinful world. As you've read through the New Testament, you have seen the depth of depravity of Israel and the nations around Israel. That no matter what God did, his people were against him. His people would shun him and turn from him, and he punished them with exile. He punished them with war. He punished them with dreadful wars. And I think one of the things to bring into the New Testament from the Old is how much God hates sin. We see that he brings apparently brutal punishment on his people, both the northern 10 tribes and the southern 2 tribes. He brings a devastating punishment on nations such as Assyria and Babylon. He brought devastating punishment on Nineveh. And this is not showing us that God is mean, but that God hates sin. He loathes it. And he'd much rather see his people perish, knowing that he will glorify himself later than allow them to continue in sin. We probably had that experience ourselves with children or grandchildren who walk away from the Lord, turn from the Lord, and for a time we grieve, we're sorrowful, we do anything to get them to come back to the Lord. And that's God in you. That's the image of God lamenting over his people. And God takes that further, and he absolutely crushes his people. And Jesus comes into a world that suffered the evil and the results of the evil that sin brings, the evil that Satan produces, as well as God bringing punishment and chastisement and trying to get his people to turn. So Jesus comes into that world. And Jesus comes into that world, it tells us in Matthew 1, according to the plan of God. There's a genealogy there. Last time there was a genealogy in the Hebrew Bible, anyway, it's a little different order than ours, is in Chronicles. First and Second Chronicles are one book in the Hebrew Bible. It's at the very end of the Hebrew Bible, so if we were reading a Hebrew or a Jewish Bible, we would read Chronicles, then Matthew. Chronicles begins with a genealogy that concludes with the genealogy of David. Matthew opens with a genealogy that picks up and ends with the coming of David's son, Jesus. I think Matthew is communicating to us that he is telling us the end of the story, that the kingdom is coming. And as we look at the Gospel of Matthew, that's what we see is Jesus as king. Each of the Gospels have a different focus. It's kind of the life of Jesus in stereo. So Matthew looks at Jesus as king, Mark as servant, Luke as the Son of Man, and John as the Son of God. They all have a different perspective on Jesus, bringing that perspective out so we have a full view of him. When we come to Matthew, it's about the kingdom. Jesus is king. He's the coming king. In chapters 1 through 11 verse 1, is the offer of the kingdom to Israel. This long anticipated kingdom. Jesus offers that to them. they reject it. So beginning in 11:2 and going through the end of Matthew is the rejection of that offer of the kingdom. That's we're in the section now about Jesus offering the kingdom. We're coming into the preaching of the king, chapters 5 through 7, known as the Sermon on the Mount. This is one of 5 sermons that Matthew's gospel is built around. So Jesus has a sermon, and then there's a section of history. Another sermon, a section of history. So that's what we go through. This is Jesus' first sermon. It's the preaching of the king, we could call this, and it starts out in chapter 5, verses 1 through 12, with this beautiful section called the Beatitudes. You've probably heard of that before. The Beatitudes are speaking about the character of the people who will be in the kingdom, the character of those who will be blessed when the kingdom comes. The church is not the kingdom. We'll see that as we go through the New Testament. Jesus will bring that kingdom. He's not bringing it now in Matthew. He's going to bring it at the end of Revelation because it gets rejected here by Israel. But as we go through Matthew, that'll become clearer and clearer. But look at some of the things that he's saying here in these verse 12 verses. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. This is the character of the people who will be in the kingdom. There will be people who mourn sadness, who will mourn over sorrow, who will mourn over sin, and they will be comforted. The king will be there to comfort them. Look at verse 5. Verse 5 is, to me, fascinating, interesting. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. That's actually a quote from the Old Testament. You read this before in Psalm 37, verse 11. It's a little different there where it says, Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the land. The word translated here, earth, is a word that means land. The translator has made a choice, but what Jesus is to say earth, but what Jesus is saying here in the Greek text, and I think he's echoing the Hebrew text, is that the meek are going to be welcomed into the land that God has promised to Israel. They're the ones who are going to be populating the kingdom. Not the strong, not the ones who deserve it, but the meek. The meek will be there. So that's verses 1 through 12 in today's reading. Talk about this new character. Verses 13 through 16 make a transition to a new calling for people, God's people who are going to be in the kingdom. It says, you are the light, salt of the earth. But if salt has lost its taste, how can its saltiness be restored? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled under people's feet. So here's a statement. This is your character. This is your new calling to be the salt in the world. And also a challenge to really be that salt, to really be the preservative that God intends you to be in the world. Starting in verse 17 then, we come into a long section of what we're to be, the life in the kingdom, about new conduct. And I'm going to divide this into several sections here. First one is Jesus has fulfilled the law in verses 17 through 19. What law is he talking about? He's talking about that law from Moses, that law from Deuteronomy, that law that God's people in the Old Testament, before Jesus came, they had to keep that law. Jesus has kept the law. That's what he's saying here. As king, he's kept the law for us. But that doesn't mean that we are suddenly without any guidance or any direction or any rule about how we are to live. So that he goes on to say how he's transformed that law. Beginning in verse 20, he says, for example, 21, think how shocking this must have been to his original hearers. You have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not murder, and whoever murders will be liable to judgment. What's he talking about here? He's talking about the 10 Commandments. He's talking about what you've already read, Exodus 20. He is saying, you've heard this said, but then look what he goes on in verse 22. But I say to you, Jesus is changing the law that God gave Moses on his own authority. How shocking this must have been to his hearers in that first Sermon on the Mount. He says, everyone who's angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. Whoever insults his brother will be liable to the council, and whoever says, "You fool," will be liable to the hell of fire. Jesus has fulfilled the law, but he has not tossed it aside. He's transformed it. He's raised the stakes for those in the kingdom. And remember, those in the kingdom will be people who have been transformed according to what we read in Jeremiah chapter 31. Their hearts will have been changed so that they have the law of God written on their hearts. That's what Jesus is referring to here in transforming the law. And then he transforms piety. Go to chapter 6. So chapter 6 begins a new section, verses 1 through 18, where he's talking about how in the kingdom piety is transformed, our religious practices are transformed. He says, "Beware of practicing your righteousness before other people, in order to be seen by them, for then you will have no reward from your Father who is in heaven." And then he goes on and specifies when you give or when you pray and things. So he's transforming not only the law, but he's transforming piety. He is again raising the stakes. And he's telling them that when this kingdom comes, you're going to have been transformed by the new covenant, by Jeremiah 31 through 33. And this is what you're going to be like. This is what it's going to be like in the kingdom. And then beginning in verse 19 of chapter 6 and going through verse 12 of chapter 7, talks about transforming practice, our practices. So he talks about here, let's see, when you fast in verse 16, maybe we back that up from 19 to 16. When you fast, do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth in verse 19. Verse 23, the eye is the lamp of the body, so if your eye is healthy, your whole body will be full of light. That is, what you see, if you are looking at the right things, if you are considering the right things rightly, your whole being will be transformed. So again, this is our reading for today. Let me just close this up by way of application. Even though we're not in God's kingdom at this point, Jesus hasn't come and established this kingdom, we know what the future holds for us. We know what God intends for us. So why not begin that process today? Why not begin to live like this and listen to what Paul says, for example, in Romans 12, where he says, "Do not be conformed to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you'll be able to test and approve what God's will is, God's good, pleasing, and perfect will." God's will is not a mystery. God's will is not something that we have to be searching for. God's will is revealed to us, and it's revealed to them who are being transformed by the renewing of their mind. That's you and I, brothers and sisters. So as we start in the New Testament here, let's remember that Jesus is painting a picture for us of what that kingdom is to be like and how we are to begin living today as his people. So God bless you. Enjoy the book of Matthew and enjoy your time in the New Testament.